Katja, thank you so much for joining me for this quick Q&A. Post-webinar, how are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well. And I should just say again how much I enjoyed the seminar, how much I enjoyed the panel discussions and the insight from my other panelists. So thank you again for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. As always, it's our pleasure. So I just wanted to follow up on some of the themes that we discussed in the webinar. One of the big questions around, investments into new ventures, perhaps, is the idea of like greenwashing, and it's still a huge issue. But truly, are there enough green investment opportunities out there?
I think so. And that is because it all depends on what you define as green. And and there is a huge range, that I thoroughly believe actually makes sense from a perspective of getting to 1.5 degrees. There is, of course, what I would call the crème de la crème of dark green investments that are either net zero in themselves or might be even negatives, if you want to say so. There are not too many out of them there. I take that. And to develop those, we will need technology, and we will need the technology advances that you can have. But there is a lot of good stuff, and I can just say a lot of good stuff that investment firms can do in order to helping the less developed one, to helping the polluters to continue to get greener. And the trick for these types of investments, which I still believe are very, very valuable, is communication, and transparency, i.e. the customer needs to understand if a label ESG is on a fund or on a life product or whatsoever, what type of ESG, for lack of a better word, the customer can expect. Let's also not forget our customers have very different perception about what ESG means for them. So then this communication and this transparency is key. And it's not somewhere in the terms and conditions on page 18. It must be on page 1.
Absolutely. And of course, financial institutions are always in the middle of these sort of conversations. So there's a certain responsibility that comes with that. But speaking of responsibility, there's a lot of regulations that have come in terms of, so regulatory reporting, for example. How does that impact insurance companies?
Well, I think kind of at a high level, it shouldn't impact too much, because if you want to do the right thing in that space, the regulation by and large should help. Having said that, the regulation is tough to implement. And not because it's regulation, but because the underlying issues are tough to implement. One of the toughest items that we feel, that many of our competitors feel, is actually exactly these reporting requirements. Not because we don't want to, or not because we do not see the value. It's simply that many of our databases predate that discussion. Many of our databases are not meant, or were not meant originally, to capture certain ESG features. So just getting data together in a consistent format is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge that is put rightfully on us, and it's a challenge that the industry will raise to and will manage. And again, it comes all back to what I said before, to communication and transparency. And for that item, the reporting standards are a good thing, even though they are tough.
And you've already touched upon this, but with regards to ESG, so when you put a label ESG on it, you don't necessarily know whether that's an environmental or a social governance type of ESG. And we tend to usually focus on the environmental factor because, that's kind of what a lot of things are talking about. But how can we incorporate the social governance factor into these decision-making processes?
I think in a very similar way to the environmental one. And by the way, the governance factor kind of works exactly the same. It is about finding out which are the key drivers that make your product social as regard, or as in addition to environmental. And that can be thing about equal pay, no discrimination in the funds or in the companies or in the projects you invest to. It will have to do with supporting the community that you invest to. It might have to do again with anti-discrimination, about racial racial discrimination or whatever it might be. It can be other support mechanisms that talk to the social side. The selection process and how you define the criteria for your specific product or your specific fund can work exactly the same as on the environmental side. It's just that the criteria tend to be social. And the same, by the way, happens for the governance bit as well. The governance bit, I think, kind of is relatively close to standard compliance, AML, anti-bribery, just good governance standards that we have anyway, or that we should have. It's not the same as compliance, it's more, but it's not unfamiliar to many of us. So here again, be clear about the criteria you select and be clear that you stick up and stand to your word in your selection process of items to invest.
Absolutely. And just to end on a positive note, looking forward to next year, to 2022, what is it that you'd like to see the sector do more of, and what will you be focusing on next?
It will be kind of the same that I said at the beginning: communication, communication, and communication. Because for me, it's all about being transparent, what you do, and therefore also to take customers and their expectations and their perceptions with you. And by this also giving customers the choice between what you do and maybe what others do.
Katja, thank you so much for joining me and for sharing your insights. I'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. And thanks again for giving me the opportunity.